Well, welcome back after a great conversation with Commissioner Danley. We really appreciated his time here and really learned quite a bit. Excited for this next panel. Amanda Connor from AEP will be moderating it, and really focused on the discussion of how will states, how will WIRE's members, how will the federal government work together to implement provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law. Also want to give special thanks to Rob Hobart, who's a member on this panel, for really helping put the panel together and going above and beyond there. So let me turn it over to Amanda Connor, who will provide some more introductions to the panel as well as the individual panelists. So thank you, Amanda.
Great. Thank you, Will. So really excited about this panel. I think you all have a lot of perspectives to offer us. And of course, this is our business, but in a lot of ways it's new territory for us. This is a major initiative. So I think there's a lot of details to be unveiled as to how this is going to work, how we're going to operationalize what's in the bill. So I want to introduce our panelists here. Starting with the end, we have Teja Kuruganti from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And then Tony Niknejad, he's a policy director in the Office of Tennessee Governor Lee. And then, of course, Rob Hobart, who's the founding partner of HHQ Ventures. So thank you for joining us. And I thought we'd just kind of start with Teja, and I'd like to hear kind of your impressions, your insights on the bill, what opportunities and challenges you might see regarding the use of funding specifically for power and energy initiatives in the bill. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, it's the challenge is keeping them brief. It's a big bill. Like Amanda said, I'm Teja Kuruganti. DOE realigned right after the bill to actually focus and actually channel some of these demonstrations, what are the technology needs, and how do we foster that technology development to support various aspects of the bill, right? So or the law. It is a broad act, significant technology deployment, both existing and new novel technology that early adopters would come and deploy. A lot of the things that we see at the lab are both working on this innovative technology and then enabling scalability of this technology. How do we take current challenges within the grid and provide solutions to that? How do we bring in next generation technologies into the grid and demonstrate value, right? And actually project how it can be integrated into this next generation grid. The key things, the challenges, you asked challenges, the key thing as we go towards renewable energy, as we go towards clean energy, balancing reliability and flexibility and resilience as well as security of the grid. So these are non-orthogonal parameters, right? So if you're trying to put more uncontrollable generation, you have to get flexibility from the demand, for example. So we're used to a grid that's load following. So the generation is controlled and the load is to the large extent not controlled, and we chase the load. And as we have a generation which is uncontrolled and we want to maximize, right, maximal utilization of such generation, new kinds of scalable control technologies have to come into the picture and actually be deployable, right? There are a lot of solutions. The key challenge is how do we take these solutions, scale them, and have innovative business models where they can be deployed at scale, which provide value to both utilities and provide value to the customers. I'm going to pause there and then we can circle back.
Tony, would you like to offer your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for coming here. We welcome you to Tennessee. In my work in the governor's office overseeing federal affairs and federal grant programs, we have seen, I look at this act through the lens of comparison with the American Rescue Plan and the Coronavirus Relief Fund that came before it. And I think what we've seen is slowly as the federal administration has started to move more into a long-term infrastructure focus, they've also started to look more at other kind of collateral social or other economic policies that they're bringing in. And so for us, a major concern that we're flagging and that we're working with peer states on is how can we work to more quickly implement these portions of the act and try to shift away from concerns that may not be primary to building a more resilient future. For the governor specifically here in Tennessee, we have invested significant amounts of both state and federal funds into growing our infrastructure. We have multiple electric vehicle infrastructure initiatives going on at our Department of Environment and Conservation, and we've also launched one of the biggest sewer and water infrastructure rebuild programs of any peer state that I'm aware of here using American Rescue Plan funds. So I think the message that we are, and the dialogue that we're having with the administration is let's focus on the nuts and bolts of this and get this right, and let some of these more collateral, social or broader philosophical policies kind of shift back to a secondary role.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Tony. Rob, what kind of thoughts do you have to offer?
Yeah, I was asked to talk about the federal side and kind of give an update of where I think DOE is in implementing the IIJA. And one thing, first of all, welcome to Nashville. I do live here. I lived in D.C. for 19 years, and then I moved my family here to raise them here, and I commute back and forth. And it's nice to see people in conferences. Tony and I were talking about, we always had a lot of visitors and people coming to downtown Nashville, but it's nice to start seeing the business community come back and do conferences again. So thanks for entertaining and coming to Nashville. I was there during the American Recovery Act, and then obviously been following the CARES Act, and there's a lot of similarities and challenges that the department and the government has. From the federal side, they've been focusing on collaboration and engagement with stakeholders on transmission deployment. They've been focused on transmission planning and trying to determine a path forward, obviously. They're developing and deploying the $20 billion under their purview and all the different financing mechanisms that are available, some that are brand new. They're also facilitating interagency specifically on the permitting process to facilitate streamlining, and that will obviously be a key interest to all of us in the sector and how that actually works and how the interagency process works as well. Lastly, they're prioritizing transmission RD&D. So, where are the priorities focused on? Is it cyber resiliency? How do we get to reduce costs? How do we get to adoption quicker? Those are all the key 5 goals that they've been working on. In concert, they have 2 main studies that they're working on. Obviously, one's the National Electric Transmission Needs Study, which supposedly a draft's coming out in the summer. I think it may be pushed a little bit, but that's the objective. The second one is a joint DOE BOEM focus on offshore wind and their goal on their 30 gigawatt metric by 2030. So a process, they're doing workshops right now. And so engagement, in my opinion, on these things are at an all-time high. I think that one thing I'll throw out is that there's a ton of opportunity. One, when we did ARA, the modernization of the grid and infrastructure wasn't the focus. It was on renewables deployment. It was on efficiency, utilizing loan guarantees and other types of financing mechanisms. The good thing is the department has restructured their organization. It's focused on infrastructure. It's focused on grid. It's focused on deployment, which is good. I said that there's, obviously a focus, like I said, unlike ARA, there's a focus on grid modernization, and there's money attached to it for the first time in a significant way. I think that the innovation investment is a key focus as well. I think that's going to be interesting to see how they roll that out and how they prioritize that, because as you guys know, putting new and innovative technology onto active grids and transmission is obviously challenging. And when you want to you have an administration that's focused on deployment, if you can get the entities like your organizations, utilities and the like, to be able to participate in those type of programs, there needs to be incentives and surety around financing, technology, and risk. Not without the challenges, there also is not without the opportunities, but there's a ton of challenges, obviously. The good thing is there's a lot of money available. The bad thing is there's a lot of money available. And when you have a lot of money in a system, on top of a delayed budget system that we have at the federal level, it's a pretty aggressive, and as everyone knows, trying to get back into a new norm after COVID. We don't have, at the federal level, we're just still opening up, right? And that's not, I know Teja's got the same thing at the laboratory level. State government has the same challenge. I mean, getting people back in the agencies to review these things and having the appropriate staff to be able to implement the things on time is going to be a challenge in Washington in these agencies. Doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means it's going to take a little bit longer than anticipated. But the political will to focus on this, and there's a political incentive to drive to execution in the infrastructure bill. It doesn't come without some other challenges, as we all know, because once you're starting to do large-scale deployments of new technologies that require environmental permitting and planning, and then if you add on the new things that they've talked about, which we didn't have during ARA, which was environmental and energy justice, it's a challenge. Stop there.
Great, thank you all. I thought I'd start out with a few kind of general questions, and I'd also welcome you asking questions of each other because I think it's important to have a good dialogue here, and I think you've raised a lot of interesting issues. But I thought I'd start with Teja. What types of immature or new technologies do you see really benefiting from the funding in this bill that maybe we haven't focused on in the past?
Yeah. You can see them from demand side all the way to the generation, transmission side. A lot of innovative technologies, flow control, power flow control at scale. These are some of the things that can come into the picture. So when you have a grid that has to be flexible, and if we want to manage flows across at the transmission scale, we know fax devices, for example. How do we miniaturize them? How do we make them economical? Bringing more power electronics is in the next generation grid, both for both for supporting the renewables, but also enabling advanced control functions on the transmission side. As you go down to the demand side, as I mentioned earlier, we don't aggregate and control demand. It is a challenge. We know how to do that. We know how to take buildings. Buildings consume more than 70% of the electricity in the country, right? How do you aggregate that and then create new load shapes? That requires new control technology that scales. Grid inertia asks in megawatts, and buildings can provide maybe kilowatts, right? So which means aggregation is necessary. How do we scale those stable solutions so that as we go to the next generation, going through all these deployments, our load shapes are going to change. More electrification, both from heat pump side on the demand, or electric vehicles, and electrifying transportation. Load shapes are going to drastically change. So being able to control at a scale these load shapes. So these are some of the new technologies that will need to be there at various stages of design and development. When you go to deployment, we always watch at the lab. At a very low TRL level, you can develop technology. They all work perfectly in the lab, and we go into the field, what we call field, right? We have our own transmission test beds, which is a couple of lines, things like that. As you go through those stages of development, deployment, and evaluation, you kind of attenuate some of the significant impact or advantages of the technology, because deployment always brings in new requirements. Once you go into the field, is it secure, right? Is it going to be reliable? What is the mean time between failure? All of those don't matter when you're doing pure technology development. So going through this, so there are challenges on the systems engineering side, opportunities and challenges on the systems engineering side and scalability, new opportunities from device scale to systems, all the way.
I'll just add, on the federal side, from an implementation perspective, when they're doing their process to seek proposals for projects and innovation, some of the challenges that they have, when you think about when we did Recovery Act, it was all about innovation, right? And if you look back, we did some analysis after all the awards were let after the Recovery Act, and even though that during the administration it was all about innovation and green energy and green jobs and innovation, they at the end of the day, we looked at Silicon Valley was very excited about, the VCs were excited about their early stage technology. They were going to scale up and move forward. But the way the scoring criteria for some of the awards and financing programs that were available to them actually ended up more, there's only probably 25% of the money that was awarded in green energy was actually to innovative companies. It was more, they take more, when you go through the scoring criteria of these applications, at the end of the day, 30 to 40% is on financing and your ability to cost share, and your ability to execute is another 25%. And so when you look at maybe these startups have great technologies, but they've never commercialized anything, the government usually goes towards the more safe bets of execution. And then you couple that with being a little conscious of projects failing and investing a lot of money in public sector dollars on that, then they get a little bit even more risk averse. And so there's innovation, and then there's making sure that we actually get the achievable metrics of these projects done and completed. And so those are the things that they kind of have this, I guess, this bifurcation of desire versus responsibility.
Yeah, and both of those comments are really interesting here. I'd be curious to hear more from you, Teja, and maybe also from you, Rob, of obviously we're trying to move the goal of this bill and the goal of subsequent acts is going to be to move the grid into this 21st century posture, right? We want to be responsive to the consumer who wants to have an electric vehicle, wants to have a battery in his house for grid instability periods. But how is that change? What's going to really drive that change, or what's going to differentiate the areas or regions of the country that embrace that change more than others? Is it going to be political will? Is it going to be the consumers adopting these demand-side technologies? Where do you really see the interplay of, or where do you see the pressure coming from to move forward?
I can talk all of those factor in, but I can talk from the technology standpoint, right? If we want a secure and resilient grid. I mean, I don't think that's a given. To do that, creating flexibility in the grid, just the term flexibility in the grid, where I have flexible generation and I have to create some flexibility in the load, will drive some of this technology development and deployment. So that's, to me, that is a driver. We need that that flexibility. So which requires control systems, which requires storage, because renewables are inherently intermittent and there is stochasticity in their generation. So all of this drive those needs. And technical solutions, the technology solutions can bridge that gap, right? How do we scale that and demonstrate that? That's one aspect. And how do we deploy them and draw value from them at a utility scale and at a national scale? Those are the next generation questions, right?
Do you think there's a role for perhaps efficiency from power generators? The idea of recapturing lost power, where do you see that? Is there an economic incentive at that level you see?
I don't know if I can comment on that. Efficiency in general, if you see demand side heat pumps and efficiency, improving efficiency in general is definitely, there is a role for that. Power loss, reducing the loss of transmission loss on the distribution circuits. There is definitely technical solutions that can be driven by that need and would come into the picture that can reduce our need for transmission planning. Do we do inter-region transmission planning versus a different way of transmission planning? That's probably the biggest thing that comes from efficiency, where I'm generating power and how do I send that power back to the consumers?
I think some of the challenge from the implementation standpoint is going to be, well, one, you see, even though that there's some aggressive targets and deadlines for rolling out these new programs, they are definitely, especially for the newer programs in grid, they're going through a very, I would say, a thoughtful process of asking for, it's a notice of intent, then it's an RFI, then they're doing workshops, then they're doing webinars, then they're going through a process, because I believe that they understand that this is happening in real time and it's not been done, right? And there's, unlike when we were doing manufacturing grants for solar panels, or we were doing back in the day, that was a single entity owner of a technology, of a manufacturing plant, and it was pretty buttoned up. This is multifaceted. You have vendors that want to sell technology that are cyber secure, resilient. You're on an active grid that someone else owns. You have to get approval from different authorities to do this. You have to do an environmental assessment, and then you're integrating different renewables platforms into an active grid. I think there's just so much more complicated factors than they were back in the day, and so you're going to see, I say thoughtful, it's going to be longer times to get to the thing, and so that's why I also encourage, and I think the FERC commissioner was correct too. I mean, everyone has to engage of all the challenges and opposition or support for the way these things are being structured, because, I mean, the sad thing is we finally got $20+ billion of federal level focused on modernizing the grid to make sure that we're more cyber secure and the like and resilient to weather. But if no one takes advantage of it or we can't implement it correctly, it's a missed opportunity at the end of the day.
So Rob, you brought up something that I was going to kind of follow up on. So what opportunities are there for cyber enhancements as a result of this funding? And this could be for any of you. I was initially thinking, Teja, you might have some thoughts on this. From a technical standpoint, what this money could be used for. But that's definitely a focus of the bill as well, and kind of fits in with the new technology angle.
I mean, yeah, there's, I can provide for the whole group the breakdown of all the programs and where they come in on an annual basis. But, the smart grid investment to build off the last round, it's $600 million a year for 5 fiscal years that there's availability to it. Obviously, some of the money for hardening, for instance, for the hardening of the grid, that is yet to be defined. But they're asking, like last night they put out an RFI for a whole bunch of different questions on how that $3 billion or $2.5 billion would be spent. Industry has a ability to put together projects with vendors and compete. Then there's states and localities have partnerships that they can work on. There's formula grants that are yet to be determined because of data. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think that the challenge is going to be, and I work for some, I advise some cyber advising or cyber companies that work on different technology applications. It's very hard to get into the market to work with utilities, and I represent utilities too. So it's not to be negative. It's just that the laboratory structure is really the only thing that we have in the United States to do active testing. And some of these facilities that Teja has mentioned are just getting, we're just expanding our ability to do that. So it's not unlimited to be able to do these things and to the modeling and simulation. So before those happen and before you start seeing real dollars work out, or there's adoption by utilities or states or different, transmission systems, I think that you've got to prove out that what you're saying that the vendors can do in cyber is proven, and because you can't put that much at risk for all of your customers at that point. I don't know, Teja, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. So I work on a project called North American Energy Resilience Modeling, NARM. Project is primarily looking at engineering class modeling tools at interconnect scale, trying to see the interdependence between infrastructure, gas, electric, communications, all of them. They're very synergistic, and impact on one impacts the other, and so on. How does that impact propagate, and being able to analyze these threats at scale using modeling? So that's one end of the spectrum. As Rob mentioned, going all the way to device level and having these active test beds where we can, across the National Lab Complex, to able to evaluate the technologies that we need to bring into the picture for making not only cyber secure grid, but also cyber physical secure. A lot of the times when you see things on control systems, it's not the same as IT cybersecurity. You have to worry about actual machines and wires and humans. So there is a lot there, right? There is a lot in the IIJA for addressing cyber risk, understanding the risk, what are the metrics, existing technology, understanding how do we harden that, all the way from threats from cybersecurity all the way to bigger events that can cover large geographical areas, that kind of thing. So some of the things that the automation that is needed to create the next generation grid inherently increases your, and this is what happened during the ARRA, right? I worked on cybersecurity profiles back then for smart meter integration. This is new. We're putting a lot of smart meters at that time, coming up with what is the right way to do it, and how can utilities take information and prescriptively put it in their RFPs when they bid out contracts with vendors, so that this is, instead of quoting cybersecurity, what are my metrics for cybersecurity when you provide a solution to me, and how do I verify this solution as opposed to trusting that you gave me a secure solution. So the point is, as we increase this flexibility and resilience in the grid, inherently automation will expand, which ergo the cyber surface will expand. So we have to keep all of that, and the Act has a lot of ask for providing solutions for cyber hardening.
One of the things that we're concerned about, but it's this legislation provides a political opportunity for us, is actually to shift the back of focus on workforce and education. So something that we know has been a concern for our industry sector here in Tennessee is we just don't have the domestic labor supply to do all these projects. And at the same time that we're seeing international supply chain challenges, we're also seeing international labor supply chain challenges. And so whether it's, federal policy has been slow to restart visa application processes that we get engaged in, or we just have projects that are getting delayed because the vendors don't have the engineers in place to do the work. We're working very hard here in Tennessee on building that pipeline starting in middle school, and that's something that's been an effort for multiple years now. But the way for us to be successful in that is going to be through our partnership with our industry partners. So I think one of the things that we are encouraging industry to work with us on is to please communicate and be very transparent about where those labor supply challenges are, so that we can start to steer the ship on the education pipeline.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm speaking for AP, but I think others in the room, we can relate to that problem. We're all feeling that, unfortunately, and hope there's some relief around the corner on that, because obviously those are extremely important jobs.
Yeah, and the thing that we're grappling with, and I think it's kind of sobering to think about, is that there probably isn't a quick fix outside of a vast change in immigration policy, which could be a pretty could be beneficial, but demographically the country is trending towards we're just not producing enough, and so we're going to need some real structural change in our education system, I think, to meet that demand, and to not just build over these next 10 to 20 years, but to actually keep us from 25 years from now having being in the same spot that we are now, which is looking back saying we've let our infrastructure fall to in need of maintenance and upgrade.
And I'll add that in almost every one of the RFIs for the IIJA, whether it's in Department of Transportation or Ag or Department of Energy applications, there's 3 new things that have been talked about. Actually 2 new things and one kind of refocused. Workforce development is definitely one of them in there, and it basically, they ask, how do we more aggressively deal with the workforce development issues? That was obviously the green jobs of the ARA that there was focused on, but the other 2 are STEM diversity is the other one, and then the last one is environmental and energy justice. STEM diversity and environmental and energy justice are really, at the federal level, undefined concepts. Undefined from a metrics perspective, and so they're seeking feedback from industry organizations that may participate into IIJA implementation, whether you're in transportation or energy or ag, and say, okay, what processes do organizations have that they're taking these things into consideration? I know from my utility clients that we have very stringent processes that we've been doing this to take into consideration for those communities. But the fact of the matter is that it's such a highlighted and prioritized item for this administration The question is how does that actually go into what I call sometimes strings attached to money that's being received by them? And is it going to be, because there is no currently, for government capital, if it's deployment, it's 50%, and if it's R&D, it's 80-20. There is no scoring metric that I've seen that actually gives a percentage towards workforce development, STEM diversity, or EEJ. And then if that is the case, then the question is can the industry meet the metrics? Can the states meet the metrics? And do some states that can take advantage of it and others don't? I just don't know. And so that's still to be determined and still to be worked out.
Great, thank you. So Tony, I had a question for you, and I think we kind of talked around this a little bit, and it kind of relates to workforce development, but a little bit different. Do you see opportunities for the funding to enhance economic development in your state? Especially when you talk about building a workforce. Part of doing that is making the state attractive with communities that are up and coming, that attract different demographics.
Yeah, and stop me if I'm not answering the question here, but I think one of the things that we've been really intentional about in Tennessee is we're a very long state. We have a few major metro areas, but we have a lot of sparse rural areas in between. And when it comes to really the basics of power generation, clean water, effective sewers, broadband, and roads, those are all areas where our rural areas have really fallen behind. And so as part of our economic development strategy is we focus a lot on building infrastructure there and building sites that employers see as attractive. We have a long history here, of course, with TVA, their partners in that. I think that's something that all states are going to be looking to their energy partners as how do we, if we have rural areas and rural communities, how can we partner on economic development? So that's something that is always driving what we do and will definitely drive our implementation of this act.
I think you actually answered the question, so. Larry, how are we on time? 15 more minutes? What I'd like to do is, if it's okay with everyone, kind of open it up to the audience to see if you have questions for the panel, and I have some additional questions too. But any questions from the audience? All right.
Yep. Thanks, Drew. Hi, David Townley with CTC Global. I just didn't hear it, so it's a comment and maybe some more information, but yesterday afternoon, 4101 came out, so request for information, a webinar next week, and public comments, I guess, early June. And of course, those are coming out of the deployment office, right, grid deployment office, and we're expecting two more, the facilitation program, 106, and the 107, smart grid, right? So are those right behind this one? Are they all coming out right together? And can you say where 103, the state energy, who's running it?
So, two things. One, you're right, that was the one I mentioned on the hardening of the grid RFI that came out late last night. It's unclear, and I actually did ask for coming to speak to some folks inside the DOE Office of Grid to see if I could get an anticipation of a time frame. This kind of goes back to my point of there's two things. One, we're in the middle of a reorganization in the department. Teja's colleague over at the lab has been detailed into that office to help move forward with those projects because we don't have enough staff to really move a lot of these things, right? And they have a lot to move forward on. So unclear about if they're coming through, but I know they're definitely knocking them down one at a time because until they actually staff up and they You know, I mean, ultimately, the secretary has been advocating for we need 1,000 to 5,000 new people. And you think about this, this is just to help run and try to start implementing comment periods and things. That's not to even do it when we go into application time, and you need the appropriate staff, both from a technical perspective, from a financial perspective, and an engineering perspective. We do not have those at the federal government to be able to handle the amount of applications across government to do that, let alone the Department of Energy. And so I think that that's the reason why this huge push to get people inside, they're putting in contractors, they're drawing from the laboratory resources that they can do to try to make sure that we move things and we keep having things move forward, even though they're taking longer than some politically would like. So that's on the federal side. I don't know actually the answer on the state program at this point. And I will say though that, you know, the way that they did the reorganization, you have the Office of Deployment, right? So you have the new Office of Grid, and then you've got Caesar and like, and then you still have OE and other things, and they're kind of straddled in between the two assistant secretaries. You know, the bifurcation of money, people, time, and program jurisdiction or oversight is still, I think, working on in real time, and it will probably for the next year or so. The traditional budget that came up, even though it came up, you know, a couple months late for 23, still had kind of the original structure. And so they're doing two things in real time. The department is implementing their FY22 budget while they have all this money, the $60+ billion from the IIJA to implement on top of that. And that's doubling what the annual budget of the department is. So they're spending $90 billion in, like, you know, I mean, it's not all at once, but getting these programs stood up. And so the amount of money and activity that needs to go out there to be able to move these programs efficiently and effectively is quite daunting.
I would just comment that's very typical of multiple federal agencies right now, even those that don't have as high technical demand. I was in DC in March around the time of negotiations around the most recent COVID package, and I was there with representatives of multiple other states, and one of the things we heard from senators and their staff was, where are you spending the American Rescue Plan dollars you got? Why don't we know where the money is? And we told them Treasury released the guidance, the final rule last month. So you should not be asking us. You should be asking the federal agencies when this stuff is going to get out the door. So there's also a little bit of a political dilemma there where I think the appropriators are wondering what's going to happen and may have to apply some pressure in order for stuff to get out the door and maybe not make perfect the enemy of the good in implementation.
I just want to add briefly that the RFIs are coming in. Take time to comprehensively respond to that. That helps shape up the calls that would come later.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Oh.
Nick Sicali for Gibson Dunn. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel today and speaking with us. My question is a little unique. I want to try to get you guys to spin your wheels a little bit on something that is a major factor in the use of this money. It's the first time in a while where one of the major risks for projects is execution risk. Industry and partners are having a heck of a time getting projects over the finish line, whether it's the revocation of federal permits, state referendums, revoking state permits, but transmission and gas infrastructure alike is plagued with challenges. So just curious, you know, lots of money, as you mentioned, but what kind of protections need to be put in place or collaboration among states to ensure that this money can actually be put to use?
Yeah, I'd say that's the biggest dilemma that we're facing right now with all of this funding. And, you know, with typical wars, if you were looking out, you had enough time, you might put those protections into the planning process on the front end. We're not going to subgrant something unless you can show us that you have the labor in place and you have the permits in place, and we're not going to move forward on, half ready projects. But the federal government has also put a lot of deadlines on liquidation of these funds that are very short. So I think I think you're gonna have to see some level of greater risk taking than you normally would see from government. I've actually started to hear in conversations with local government partners that I've heard a couple of them say, well, and if we don't get the project finished, the federal government will just, they'll give us a pass on it, or they won't take back the funds, or we'll force them to do it, and kind of engaging in this thinking that they're gonna get in a game of chicken with federal regulators. At some point, if there's enough folks doing that, then maybe it works. But if you're the only one, it doesn't quite work for you. So, but that's an indication to me that folks are willing to take more risk than we should be comfortable with.
Yeah, I think of this two ways. One, when and transportation projects, for instance, a lot of they have state transportation improvement programs. They have long lists of projects that have gone through the regulatory and permitting phases of things. And formula dollars at the federal level come to the states based off of gas tax or population alike. I mean, it's a pretty known revenue formula, right? The formulas that we're putting in the the Recovery Act, in the IIJA, are being developed, right? And so the fact of the matter is that if they're being developed, I don't know, I would say Tony and the governor don't know how much out of a certain pot of money the state of Tennessee is going to get to even cost share it. Then there's the whole other side of it, which is the discretionary pools of money, meaning that outside groups, utilities, entities can actually apply directly. And the fact of the matter is that, I worked on projects that were like, large-scale concentrated solar projects through loan guarantees, and almost stopped by a desert turtle. That was the ESA thing that was totally outside of the scope. We were finalizing the project, and an ESA report came back, and we almost endangered the entire project, right? There's one thing about trying to do, siting and permitting of pipelines and transmission, but then there's the outside groups that come out and challenge you that are separate from any other government permitting agency that don't want you to build some of these things. And that is an interesting fact, because if you're considering that you're going to approve a discretionary project at 50% cost share, the government awards it to you. Do you have to wait for all the permits and make sure you get through all the legal challenges before the money is awarded? And I think that that's still unknown. I think that is it's a major challenge, and I think that the interagency at the federal level is just one level of the interagency process that needs to really work well, because without very strict guidelines on these new programs, the risk profile of utilities, state and localities, probably goes way lower to not take on that type of a risk. And so I'm curious to see how it plays out, is really the answer I have.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned protesters, because I think they're a lot more organized than they have been in the past. They're a lot more sophisticated. And I think part of that is the social media component to it, and the availability of crowdfunding. So it's been a challenge, I think, for a lot of us in this room too, in just our normal operations. You're seeing a lot more activity there.
Well, and then if you think about, on top of this, the discussion around the environmental and energy justice in the communities, I just the lack of the definition and requirements around it, I think, endanger some of these programs, just from a standpoint if we don't do it correctly. Because I don't, obviously we know, I don't care if you're talking about you know, a wind farm, a solar farm, a nuke plant, anything that we talk about, gas pipelines, there's always an NIMBY issue, and there's always people that don't like it. And, you know, we can't, and then if you couple that with the focus on, you know, a process that's undefined, that's going to be in every application, whether you're a hydrogen hub or you're a CCUS project or you're, you know, a relicensing of a 40-year-old nuke plant. That is going to be in those criteria, and I think that that's going to be an interesting dynamic of how they're going to handle this.
From an execution risk perspective, I mean, establishing metrics and having these risk assessment frameworks, I think those are important. With this, a lot of them will be heavy technology deployment projects. So how do we establish these things? The key thing is there is technical assistance in a lot of these grants, accessing those and bringing in engineering class modeling, at least in my mind, to understand, you know, how do we, these multidimensional requirements, right? You know, the environmental requirements or EJ40 requirements as coupled with the technical requirements and performance guarantees that you need from a particular deployment. How do we manage all of those using the tools that we have and using technical assistance? That could be a good factor or a good thing to do to reduce those execution risks.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Any other questions? I think we're pretty much at 11 o'clock now and have some other things on the schedule. If there's any last questions?
I'll just interrupt for a second, just
Yeah.
to follow on to Rob's earlier comment about the environmental justice issues, and then we talked about some of the stakeholder challenges. It's a great time for me to advertise that we actually do have, through Wires coming up, a presentation from the FERC lead person in charge of environmental justice issues to talk about what her perspective is on it and some of the implications for transmission and things along that line. I think that's scheduled for May 12th, May 11th, 12th. Okay, I was right. May 12th. And then similarly in June, I think around the first or second week of June, we'll send out information on that. We're going to have the FERC Office of Public Participation come in and talk to our group about their activities. So just a little plug for all of you to keep an eye out for those events coming down the road. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. It was a great panel. I think it goes without saying that there's a lot of work ahead, you know, on how this bill is implemented in the real world here. So really appreciate your insights and especially your time and joining us. It's really valuable for us to hear your perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you.